Okay, so that's the recording. Welcome everyone for joining to this workshop about the accessibility zones for parking standards SPD. We're going to discuss where we are with the zones and kind of about current status, and then welcome any feedback that you have regarding the zones and the standards. Can you just check everyone on the Teams? Can you hear me? Is that working okay?
I hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. If you want to speak, people on Teams, just use the stick your hand up function and we'll bring you in. We're going to start off with a presentation from James, just bringing everyone up to speed on where we are, the zones, and then we'll go to a kind of discussion period, and we can welcome any questions, or answer any questions, and discuss the proposals. So to the presentation.
Yeah, so for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm James Pogue. I'm the strategic lead for transport policy and planning at the council. Where this presentation starts off is it starts off following the CAG meeting we had back in January. So it's going to be more focused on what we've done since to refine the proposals that we shared at that meeting. Just as a bit of background, the transport policy team have been leading on a revision of the parking standards SPD for couple of years now. We did a bit of work scoping it out, decided we were going to focus on a fairly targeted update of the standards we had. We commissioned some evidence gathering from an external company called Project Centre, but then because of COVID and the impact that had on travel behaviour, we had to pause that contract. Ultimately, we had to revise the contract and take some of the scope, some of the work, some of the evidence gathering they were going to undertake for us because we just data just wouldn't be reliable. So in the January CAG, we brought the work, both some of the evidence that they gathered for us, some of the work we've done ourselves in-house, and particularly the key areas of discussion was the parking zones and revision for the parking zones. So the focus was initially, as part of the scope, they were going to focus on a new set of standards for build-to-rent developments and homes in multiple occupation. As part of that, they did a piece of work looking at the revising the parking zones, informed by accessibility data. That's where they're commissioned up to. Go on to the next slide, really. So just to recap, obviously the current parking standards SPD, adopted 2016, we have 4 parking zones. As one of the key conclusions that the Project Centre work was that this didn't really adequately take account of the accessibility by public transport or about walking catchment accessibility in places either. So some of the zones are very tightly drawn around some of the town centres and related more to their retail core, rather than being a reflection of how accessible they were by walking to those facilities, to the public transport infrastructure, onward access to other facilities that they had there. So that was one of the conclusions. Hence, they concluded that they want to revise the zones in better informed by accessibility. So they went from a 4-zone approach to a 5-zone approach. So they were recommended 5 zones, like I said, informed by accessibility. And that was their kind of first draft. That map there was the kind of first draft of the work that they did, informed by that accessibility assessment. Since then, obviously, we had some feedback at the CAG meeting, and we realised there were some shortcomings and some issues we had with that first attempt. So we've gone away, looked at some other evidence, tried to refine that to make it sensible. But we have had some feedback in discussion with Highways colleagues, so Highways Development Control colleagues, and they raised concerns that it would be, by having effectively 1 zone map for HMOs and build to rents, but then having a different zone map for all other land use classes. They said A, that would be very confusing, but more importantly, B, they said developers are likely to argue that and pick at that and say, well, why is you've assessed this location as being a zone 3 police standard, but a zone 2 for this other standard, and you put us on a par with this area for this standard, with comparable accessibility to this other area. Effectively, they would argue that they would undermine it, the position would unravel a bit then. So I was advised was to try and get to a point where we had a single zone map, so to have the new zones that would reflect for the new standards for built to rent HMOs, but also then retrofit current standards we've got for all other land use classes into these new zone geographies as well. So that's what we've tried to do, and on the next slides we'll go into that.
You lose the transcript on the right. I don't believe it as it's going by.
Okay, so that's one of the changes we've made. So mindful that the scope of it's changed. So we're not just looking at those two types of land use class. We're looking at parking zone map for all land classes. Since CAG, here is some of the other changes we've made. So what we've kind of concluded is that kind of very large red zone, which is kind of an urban MK zone that Project Centre had. They were looking at it and focusing on kind of key public transport, high frequency public transport corridors, whereas the standards they got in 2016 had a much bigger zone that was for all urban MK, saying, well, actually, most of these states within the urban form of urban MK, city of MK, have got comparable accessibility, comparable kind of proximity to facilities and everything else. They should be of a consistent parking standard. We've looked at that. We think that's probably best, or workable to have an urban MK zone. Subsequent slides, I'll just recap some of the evidence we've used just to reassure ourselves that that's the right assessment, but it's taken account of access to the bus stops, the frequency of buses in the urban Milton Keynes, as well as then the MK non-responsive service, which has obviously replaced a lot of the subsidised, less frequent services we had previously. Those factors kind of reassured ourselves that a zone covering all of urban MK is still the right path from a kind of accessibility point of view. That's the first change. Second change was Project Centre had recommended quite a large parking zone covering both Bletchley and Fenny Stratford. Actually, we kind of thought that was probably incorrect with Fenny Stratford, because the accessibility from Fenny Stratford is quite different to Bletchley. Bletchley, we've got the bus station, a train station. There are much higher frequency services, destinations. Fenny Stratford's just a bit different. It's a smaller scale, kind of local centre, district centre type place. There is also a question mark about the future of this train service station as well as part of East West Rail contract. So, for various reasons, we felt it wasn't right to have the same zone covering Bletchley Fenny, having parking accessibility depending on a par with Bletchley. So we split those zones out, put Fenny Stratford down to a tier below the zone that was covering Bletchley. Wolverton, by contrast, we felt that actually you could say that is on a par with Bletchley in terms of its accessibility, both in terms of bus services, local facilities there, as well as its train service. So Wolverton we elevated up to the same zone as Bletchley. And then finally, zone 3, this what is going to be the zone 3, the urban MK zone. Zone 3, which is the district town centres. So these are kind of Stony Stratfords, Newport Pagnells, Westcroft, Kingston. We've put those. We've distinguished those out from the rest of urban MK as well, mindful of the kind of level of bus service, local facilities they have there. So elevated, largely how they current standards, 2016 standards, kept those centres slightly a zone above the rest of wider Milton. So those are the kind of key changes we've made since we came to CAG. And then some of the evidence we've taken account to inform that, like I said, that's just a summary there. The walking map catchment and that graphic in the top left is one with walking map for Bletchley. That's what we've used to kind of determine the boundary of the Bletchley parking zone and where that zone starts, where that zone ends and Ben Stratford zone starts. What we've also done is then cross-check, well, where does that leave us in terms of areas, how they compare. We've recommended new zone maps we've got, comparing them to where they are currently, current SPD, just to sense check which are there any areas that are going to radically change in terms of parking standard requirements. Just sense check that. There's a few areas that do change, but only to a level either up or down. So we're not talking about an area suddenly going from a zone 2 parking requirement to a zone 4 parking requirement. Okay, slide. And then this table is that kind of cross-checking exercise we've undertaken. Shows that those zones which are in the current zone 1, how we then map them across, retrofitted them into the new zone geography we've got. And then we've identified those zones, those areas that have either gone up a zone, down a zone. Obviously, moving from 4 zones to 5 zones doesn't fit. So what we've suggested to overcome that is the zone in the new standards, zone 2, zone 3 have the same parking requirements for now. Obviously, a future amendment, like future revision, update to the SPD, we would suggest with updated evidence around car ownership that we get from the next census data when that comes out shortly, the next 12 months hopefully, that can inform a differentiation then between new zone 2 and zone 3 parking requirements. But for now, we're suggesting they just share the same standards as written in the current SPD. What that table has done is just in yellow, the highlighted ones in yellow, has just I flagged up those areas of Milton Keynes that have now gone. If we stick with this approach, have now gone from a different parking requirement today, based on these recommendations, to what they've got today in 16 standards. So just to highlight those. Attention, Campbell Park, obviously saying that's no longer zone 1, that should be subject to zone 2 standards. So obviously that's going to be a lot more parking. In terms of ones that have moved up, the outer ring of estates, still central Milton Keynes, they've got standards. So whereas before they were subject to zone 3 standards, they're going to be future subject to zone 2 standards. Similarly, the areas that are now within the enlarged Bletchley and Wolverton zones are similarly gone from zone 3 requirements today to zone 2 standard within. And finally, just going down the page, so I need to read it now myself. Denby North. Yeah, so Denby North, we've said actually that the accessibility there is distinguished from other parts of urban FK. Denby North ones there have changed. That's zone 2 requirement to 3. Is that what it says? And similarly, those very small zones at Olney Town Centre and Wogan Sands Town Centre, said actually they're no particularly much greater in terms of accessibility terms than the rest of Olney or the rest of Wogan South. So those zones are going to have a system for the urban area. So those centres have gone down again from a. That's it. So those are really those areas that are suddenly, if we brought these recommended changes in, suddenly overnight have different parking requirements. So that's a summary of those changes and the changes we've made since ag. I think that was a lot of work, isn't it?
Yeah, just to confirm to Chris, we're staying on this slide. We're going to be leaving 12 slides. So I think I'll move to the discussion part of the presentation or workshop. If anyone else has any questions?
Yeah, I think just broad, I suppose initially it's just getting a sense really, does the approach, the five zones we've got and the areas that we've identified within those zones broadly, do they make sense? And then I think that's one question. I think subsequent to that, we can then get into the detail of perhaps where boundaries have been drawn, some of the boundaries to them. I think fundamentally it'd be nice to just understand people think the principle and what we've got there is right, and then
I think they are roughly probably if I'm not going to get something that we put. In one ward we have to that the affordable housing which now expanded is worth hitting, I think, on the parking zone expanding back beyond it. The problem is that area is a white band. So it's not a problem for highlighting, but the moment we go beyond that, it is going to be. Because they've got a white band and usually a panel as well. So we're going to have real problems if we try and point in those things beyond it.
So is that the Monkston Park?
Sorry?
Is that the Monkston Park area? So
Amongst them.
yeah.
I think there was not as much. That part of Monkston you've identified correctly, is affordable housing is close to the bus route. Take that, and also go like that. Literally in huge number. What we do about that, that's been true for 20 years.
yeah, I'd say really this has been a purely accessibility-led exercise. So that Kingston zone is broadly reflecting a kind of 100-metre walking catchment boundary, with a kind of bus interchange facilities there. We haven't taken into account.
Behind those, I'd be quite happy.
Yeah.
Once we're really on that.
Yeah, so that's.
And I don't know if you have these in other areas. I suspect that they also be true.
Yeah, it came up at the CAG meeting, didn't it? Councillor Marland was saying a bit about the white bands, you get some of that. Yeah.
I'm so concerned that we are proposing to set standards, something that doesn't exist in the virtual bank. Very different. How do we get? I always listen to the top, but.
Can I just interrupt a minute? I can't hear what that lady is saying. The sound quality is abysmal. It keeps going backwards and forwards. I heard about 25% of what she said.
Right, so I try and recap. So what Councillor Ferrens was saying was that in the Kingston ward, so we've enlarged the Kingston ward. That's now taken account of an area of Monkston, which has affordable housing, a lot of white vans, and that is evidence we hasn't been part of our evidence base. That wasn't the scope of this review. It kind of raises a question. So all very well, I suppose, being accessibility led, but when you actually get down to the local area, you see the demographics and the socio-economic nature of some of these locations. It raises question marks about whether use of parking standards would make sense. I suppose the only, yeah, I suppose that is one of those areas now. It's been enlarged. It has been from a zone.
I've got no problem with adding from finance, but
Or has it? No, it hasn't actually. It hasn't actually because it's a zone. This is where, because we're sharing, retrofitting, it'll have a zone 2 and a zone 2 and zone 3.
yeah, but I don't think the original zone went on for Kingston.
No, but for what we're saying initially, because we haven't got the evidence to suggest for some of these new zones what the standard parking standard should be, so we're using what's in the 2016 standards. If you're in a zone 2 and a zone 3 for residential, you would be subject to the same standard. At the moment,
Zone 2 and zone 3 are not the same, so whether you're talking new or old or what.
is that the areas that we've said now in the new zone 2, new zone 3, say for residential houses, they would be subject to the zone 2 standard, current zone 2 standard.
We're currently about it. I don't think the current zone 2 extended into.
I just want to understand if there's a material difference in the standard that they're subject to. I don't think they would, because the centre of Kingston in the current standard, the small Kingston zone as it is at the moment, is a zone 2.
Yeah, I mean,
The
that's
outer
not really an
area
issue
is
because
zone
there's
3.
the 2 words flat in it. On that, because you
Yeah.
extend that to half a Folkestone, that's a very different thing.
Yeah, but the actual parking in that extended area, that Monkston estate, the parking requirements is going to be no different with this change to what it is currently.
It would be the centre of Kingston that would be going down as a.
Well, no, because we're saying,
I really don't understand this because
this is at the point where we're going from fitting 4 zones that we've got currently, standards for 4 zones, to this 5-zone model.
right, firstly, you still haven't told us, I think. You gave us a table before of new zones and old zones and but you haven't told us which your 4 zones are fitted into on that table, and that we chose from 5 to 4.
This is what this table's doing. This is telling you,
We considered it.
Sent the
Was that
email.
in the presentation?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I sent the email around earlier.
Yeah, sorry, it's all presentation.
So it's slide 6.
so what this table does is the first column is saying what's the current zones, 4 zones, and what's in those 4 zones. Next column tells you what's in the 5 zone, the new 5 zones. The third and fourth column tell you which zones have actually gone up or down. Final column says which standards from the current 2016 would apply to these new zones. And so what it says is if you're in the new zone 2, the new zone 3, you will be subject to zone 2 standards that we've got today. For now, obviously in future we would want to differentiate that somewhat, but that will be informed by a better evidence base on updated car ownership data and all
Right,
that.
so we're talking about an area which was in zone 3. And it's now going to be in zone 2.
But it'll be subject to the same standard in here as it is today.
But today's revision, but not later. Do you know what to do? Sorry, I mean, the homes, you're not changing the home, the houses standard at the moment.
No, we're going to stick with the home standards that they are here.
All the houses are subject to it. We're saying. But
I don't think we can say what the future standards would be because we haven't reached that stage yet. When we, yeah.
And I'm worried about adopting a zone which will commit them to almost certainly lower standards in future. in the head, and then actually if anything expires, well, we can.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, we're talking about the likes of car ownership data from the census, so we'd actually be able to take a much closer look in terms of what the level of car ownerships are in those particular areas and whether that has any bearing on the actual zones that are being delineated. And for me, the starting question is there broad sort of agreement or any questions or queries around the principle of using accessibility as being the premise for defining the zones?
And my answer was there is that socioeconomic.
Well, I think we'll look closer at that data when we actually come to change.
Yeah, but you know, that
Yes,
is a
yeah,
fundamental
right.
point, but no, I'm not satisfied with accessibility is the sole overall.
So we would have to look at a little bit more nuanced approach in terms of what the level of car ownership is within each of those zones to see whether there's any particular significant distinction that is unique to that location.
Because maybe the equivalent location or is equivalent to because it doesn't have that problem. They also commit by trade. It's very I think the same as I know people. It's the delivery. Socioeconomic.
I presume, James, that's something census ultimately.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just seems little point in analysing the 2011 census data, so it feels we do need to wait for the 2021. Yeah, so if that is an issue, then we can't apply some of the in large zones.
So one thing you're saying is at the moment, if we do this, it doesn't actually affect the standards.
No,
So we could still apply the zones, but it has no material impact on the standards as they get applied.
Yeah.
But when we come to
And we can
look at that
look again at
evidence
the
when it
zones.
comes in the future, we can sense check those zones against the 21 census data when that comes out.
that's correct. But it's going back to that table. So those highlighted yellow ones is where there will be, if we embrace the new standards in the zones, it's those highlighted yellow ones that are, from, as of that day, they will be subject to a different parking standard. It's just the way we've mapped them across.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm also slightly worried about the collection area extending as far to the northeast. Because at that point, we might get some difference to that. So that's what it is.
yeah, yeah, I think we'd have to just measure that distance.
It's the other side of the number. I don't know it's really west of it. Our side is a perfect.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is it.
Because there's no bus in there.
Yeah, we were quite keen to stick with the catchment that Project Centre had defined for us, but then be putting a division between Bletchley and Fenny there, rather than having a kind of gap in the middle that was a further different zone. I think if it comes, yeah, we move too far over to Bletchley, effectively getting too far away from Fenny Stratford then, so it's just,
Sorry. Rephrase that. It's Northern to Penny Stratford.
it's
There's no bus posters on the bus.
yeah, it's not just buses, it isn't it? It's a proximity to the local
There's no
services.
train either. Penny is
Yeah.
also offering its local services. So. Same like years ago, it's still. I think possibly need that for the consultation and let people resolve the issue. In the southeast has buses running through, so. Service and shopping.
Yeah, well, we can take a look at take a little further look at some of the walking distances and the facilities and the bus stops.
James, can I interrupt, please? I've waited 20 minutes of my life trying to listen to you lot talking. I can hardly hear a word. It sounds like that guy that used to be on the television who used to say in front of the back. It's totally unintelligible. Either you get headsets or I'm going to have to leave, please, because this is a waste of my time.
Can you hear me talking, David? Or
I can hear you perfectly, yes.
you find this in some of these rooms when I've had team meetings that, you know, sometimes hard to hear people to the sides. If I can just recap what Jenny was saying there, she was just flagging up.
I don't want to recap. I just want to be able to hear the conversation. Where is the microphone?
I don't know. Jenny, you could sit closer to me.
If I go and sit there, you will be down with this for tomorrow.
Okay.
And if I try and talk loud, I'll start coughing again.
I can move a bit further this way. But, David, did you have any comments you wanted to make on the standards?
Well, I'm not quite sure what it's all about because I've already heard half of it. But basically, as far as CMK is concerned, I understand that Campbell Park is going to be zone 2, which means that there's to be more parking, which is fine because it's further away from buses and other forms of transport. I don't have an issue with that. I think from the map, I wasn't quite clear, but I think you're including MK East, the Brick Hill development, and all the other areas. I think one of the maps you showed didn't seem to show that, but I think the maps that you circulated earlier today does. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the kind of updated kind of urban Milton Keynes zone. So that's the zone 4, recommended zone 4, and that includes all of urban Milton Keynes, including the kind of expansion areas, includes Olney, includes Woburn Sands as well.
No problem. That's okay. And I don't have any issues with the downgrading of Campbell Park. That seems to be a good idea.
And in terms of the kind of outer ring of estates around the circling central Milton Keynes, we're proposing that should be considered on a par with kind of accessibility of Wolverton, Bletchley.
Well, to be frank, that doesn't affect us. CMK Town Council only deals with the bit up to Charles Way and Portway. So the rest of it outside that is nothing to do with us. I don't have any comments. That's up to Campbell Park and Great Linford.
Fine.
Should we go to Councillor McFay?
I'm just a bit worried about the difference between what we've got now. I'm talking, listening to Jenny say that there's a problem in that area because there's a car and white van at each house or every other house. So it's a level of granularity and trying to make it applicable across the various parts of the borough. Even taking into account Only, you've got old parts of Only where there'll be still be infill building, plus a 250 house estate. Is it appropriate to have the same level of zoning for each of those? So I think that's the balance, getting it right. But this is such a high level. I know Only, but I don't know some of the other areas. Take Davy's point that moving Campbell Park into zone 2 is okay, but it's the local knowledge, and there's only 3 councillors partaking at the moment. I don't know how we ensure that each of the wards is represented in the final solution.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say this is all to the form of a draft of a consultation. So I suppose that's the opportunity where we're giving all councillors, parish councillors, the opportunity to comment as to how is this going to, they can have a look at how is this going to actually affect them. First for now, this is just to kind of really guide us a bit while we're refining it. So we're putting at least something sensible out there. It seems to make sense. We've tried. Council Ireland at CAG was quite keen, trying to be evidence led as we can. Obviously, have to accept. We've tried to use the evidence available to us. We haven't got updated car ownership data, so we have adopted a more accessibility led approach, taking account of the current public transport offering in Milton Keynes, and that's how we come up with these recommendations. So, yeah,
So when do you expect the census 21 data to be available?
I don't think it'll be available until later this year, maybe early next year, I think. It's where it comes out and then when it comes out in an accessible format for us to be able to analyse it and things. So, we'll probably what we said at CAG was that we probably wouldn't look to do an update of these parking centres straight away with having got that availability. We'd probably look to do and the next update of the SPD we'd probably look to do as part of the next plan MK. So we're doing an update of policy direction as well as census ownership data.
If we read something, are you at the moment going to say that we're revamping this map for only or are you going to rezone the map for everybody?
Well,
Because
we're minded to go with
which it starts to
Highway Development Control. They gave us their feedback. They obviously deal with this day in, day out. And if they think having a separate zone map for some use classes to others is going to make their life very difficult, it's going to be confusing.
Yeah,
Ultimately, you're going to get bogged down in debates with developers who are going to argue about actually they should be in a more, not provide as much parking, they should be in a zone access based on accessibility levels. I'd be minded to go with their steer. I think what we've come up with that table, with the new maps and then that table, how it illustrates how we map across current standards, parking requirements to the new zones. I think it's workable. Like I say, I don't know if it's suddenly gone from needing a level of parking requirement, and they've then gone suddenly up 2 levels of parking requirement. You've only looked at a few areas, just gone down or gone up in terms of parking requirement. I don't think the impact would be. So that's where we come to in terms of recommending this is this sort of workshops for if there's something that you don't think just doesn't seem right or doesn't stack up to you, you can flag it up and you can try.
I think demographics has far more impact, larger homes than it does on. I'm not convinced that does actually work. Doesn't get really sufficient. And it's sufficient standard. And as I say, I'm also very concerned that it doesn't set a standard for building rent in areas of the city where never has been rented, zero data. So I personally would prefer if the build to rent standard is brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's something that
Sites there are going to have very.
Yeah, I think
outside of it.
just with David's benefit, this is just a question of build to rents and whether the new standard for build to rent should apply. We should have it applying a standard for all the zones. Actually, and I think what Project Centre in their evidence recognise that typically build to rents are going to be in more accessible locations. You're probably only going to get the bulk of your applications in zone 1, maybe some in zone 2.
And if they're outside that, I think they'll behave like normal flats. I don't think they'll behave like citizens.
So I think that's something we should consider, whether the build to rent, we have a build to rent standard for zones below zone 2.
Devil's advocate in me says, build to rent. I don't want to build to rent, I'm building a house. I'm going to move, I'll rent it.
No, this is, I mean, the other thing is.
Yeah, but but how do you do?
That definition needs to be in the standard.
Yes.
Like you can't stop me building a house and then renting it.
Yeah, Project Centre in their work, they've come up with a definition of what is built to rent. It is a particular class that does have. There are controls.
The impact is if you built 5 build to rent and 5 non-build to rent, they can still rent them. You've then got 10 rented houses.
No, that's not the definition.
I don't say
I didn't tell you the definition.
I didn't, Jenny. I didn't say it's a definition. I said it can happen. You can't stop me renting my house if I bought
It
it.
is not, that is not classed as build to rent.
It's not, it's the impact,
No,
Jenny.
sorry, no, sorry,
Oh, all right,
Pete, we're not talking about that, let's explain.
no, I don't need you to explain to me, Jenny. I'm
We're
just,
not talking about houses at all, for a start. That's right, you're completely not.
so this
understanding
table
what the
that
build to rent
Luke sends out that
is
says
called.
build to rent is not, actually, I shouldn't read that then.
The definition, the project centre, is that the definition? Some of the definition in here is a new residential supply for market rent in clusters with a single owner using professional management. Other definition is purpose-built housing that's typically 100% rented out. Can form part of a wider multi-tenure development comprising either flats or houses. It should be on the same site, contiguous with the main development. Schemes will usually offer longer tenancy agreements, 3 years or more, and will be typically professionally managed stock and single ownership, management and control.
So that's, I fully understand
Yeah.
that, but the ones in the multi-tenancy that you mentioned, James, we still can't stop all of them renting the houses. So the impact is the same. We've got houses that are built to rent and the ones that were built and are being rented.
Yeah,
And
I think that says that
they're
there'll be some.
contiguous. So you're looking at an area, it's the impact, it's not what the definitions are.
Yeah, I think that acknowledges that there'll be some developments where you have a mix of some that are built to rent and some other part of the development that won't be available for private ownership. In that case, our standard for build to rent would only apply to the build to rent units, and the other units would apply different simply residential.
And for that reason, once they convert to rental.
James, I presume, if we had, say, a block of flats, which were market flats, the standards that we have would be recognising the levels of car ownership associated to those, so it would recognise that there would be a portion potentially rented, and if there was a different level of car ownership for rented flats, then that would almost be baked into the standards we've got now for market properties.
Yeah.
So I think that picks up on your point that if the standards already recognise that there'll be a proportion of market properties that would be rented out, and that there may be a different level of car ownership for those rented properties as opposed to the ones which are actually home-owned or occupied.
But are you saying that the normal general housing standard would apply to those not the build to rent?
Yes, because build to rent is a very specific, different product, which is
We're
all
still not hearing
rented.
that tidying up down to ensure that that stays the same. Stays true. But apart from the fact that outside CNK, quite honestly, build to rent does not have a noticeable number of blocks of solely rented accommodation, a large part of which are full that much lower car side central area than private housing. Because if they're affordable, then
James, or somebody, can I ask a question? In central Milton Keynes, we have a lot of office to residential conversions. In your wording or in your table, what are they called?
Those would be permitted developments, but they would be classed as a C3 use. But because it's an office to residential conversion, parking standards wouldn't apply to that assessment, although parking would be impact on the highway is a consideration during those types of applications. But
Yeah, but they're not a C3 application. They're permitted development.
But at this point in time, they're not, because we've got an Article 4 direction for CMK, which removes those permitted development rights, so we would be expecting a planning application.
Okay.
That's against the policies within Plan MK, which includes parking standards. So there are the office to resi conversions that have taken place prior to the Article 4 direction being in place, which clearly we don't necessarily then have those controls over the parking provision. That might still happen elsewhere outside of CMK. CMK specifically, we've got the Article 4 direction, which means we can apply an element of control to it.
I know there is an Article 4 direction, but I thought a new one had been made and it didn't come into being until October this year.
Yeah, the existing one stays in effect until the 1st of August.
Okay,
Transitional arrangements that are in place.
so it's still in place.
At this point in time, yes.
Okay. But the new one comes into being on the 1st of August or after?
After, there's about an 8-week gap between the two.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Watch the applications fly in.
Yeah, exactly.
That build to rent will still then have no parking required because you've suggested you see what the days are.
I believe there is a difference in the requirements between different zones. There is a difference in the requirements for build to rent between different zones.
CMK is 0,
Yes,
that's zone 1.
and then zone 2 and 3 and 4 would have separate.
Yeah,
Well,
but
yeah.
he's talking about so he is the parish councillor of CMK parish. So he's talking about CMK.
Yeah, so there'll be a number of office to resi conversions which will be built to rent. So if they don't have much parking, then they're effectively consistent with the zone for CMK for build to rent. But not all office to resi conversions will be to rent. There'll be some which will be for sale developments. That's not necessarily going to be consistent with the standards that we're talking about.
You've also got the potential of the reverse of build to rent versus residential, in the sense that at the moment I understand that a lot of landlords are selling up because they can make some good profits, capital gains. Now that may happen again. So you've got build to rent, a 4-bedroom house in zone 2 only requires 1 space, but a residential dwelling requires 2 plus a third. So if you go the other way, find ourselves that we suddenly haven't got enough spaces for the residential dwelling in private ownership. So, you can't win either way. That's the problem. And therefore, I think waiting for some more information about the demographics and the trends that we will see, and taking the market intelligence at that point, in a year's time, or when Plan MK is made in 2 years' time, it will be, I think, will be quite significantly different with what's been happening and what's currently happening in the world. So we've got to be nimble in thinking about how we want to make that, or when we make Plan MK with its supporting documents. I'm not averse to what you've done, James. I just think it's a living document.
The situation is the problem.
Yeah, the challenge we've had, we've asked with updating the SPD, and we don't have the full range of evidence to do a full scale review of it. So we just tried to, like I say, target and do what we can. COVID has meant we haven't been unable to really collect any reliable details on parking occupancies, that kind of stuff. The census data. So we try to do what we can, being accessibility led. I think guided by policy as well, and what Plan MK, the kind of direction Plan MK is trying to give as well, trying to be sustainable.
Chris Taylor's dropped off. I don't know whether it's the same reasons as Davies here. So I can't expect him to walk through the door and rushing in to say, I'm here now. But he's normally very vocal, and he's within our group has certainly been making proposals that we need to completely review the SPD, not just the accessibility bit. And I'm sure you're aware of that with the GAG.
I would have thought the challenge of reviewing the whole SPD at this point in time is the census data, the base data for it. There's no change, so you'll end up with the same outcome. You need to have the up-to-date intelligence to be able to then make an informed decision about whether there's been a substantive change since the original parking standards were developed. So it kind of, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, James, I'm kind of viewing it as being we're amending the zones to be a bit more reflective in terms of accessibility, which to me sounds like it's the right thing to do, because why accessibility should be a key consideration. I mean, recognising your point, Jenny, should be a key consideration in terms of informing our parking standards, because we've seen good accessibility to public transport, walking, cycling, then that should be seen as being a positive thing that was encouraging hopefully low levels of car ownership. And that hopefully will bear out in fruition throughout the life of the new plan when we get that in place in the 2050 strategy and all of that. So that's kind of the bit we're doing right now. There's still another body of work that's going to need to be done once we know the new census data and whether that actually has any implications for car ownership level in any particular parts of the city, which will be both feed into the policy within the plan, but it will also be new evidence. I presume that would be saying, does that and have a bearing on the content of the SPV as well? So it's kind of asking the question of both. Can't really do that until we've got the output from the census, depending upon the timescale that comes out from as well. So this probably isn't changing all that much in terms of the situation we're working with at this time. It's a bit of a staging post to kind of got a bit more up to date intelligence that we can then base possibly revised, slightly tweaked zones, tweaked standards as well.
I totally agree. We're not at the right point now. Make a decision now. It's long. Takes a bit longer.
It comes down to whether these standards are improvement on our existing ones. So I don't know what the basis was for delineating our existing ones.
From what view, because the people on DCC last time said the highway did go in the opposite direction from the rest.
Ultimately, it has to be evidence-led, which is what we've done with the public centre work.
Too late. I think the problem is if you're talking about big institutional blocks in the centre, then that's one thing. We're talking about any built to rent. There's no difference between that and market housing in most of the city. I don't think we should be touching that.
Is there much built to rent outside city?
Well, there isn't. Well,
This is it.
depends on the
So-
definition of built to rent. From what you were defining there, some of the small developments or some of the other developments would count as built to rent, but they don't behave any differently from personal housing.
Does build to rent, by your definition, you would have to include social housing owned by housing associations?
Built to rent, no, it's a different class. It's built to rents, and how it is explained in here, they have just not that they rent, it's a professional management company. They have access to various on-site facilities. Some of them have gyms, some of them have bike park clubs.
And retirement villages.
So what? Okay, guys.
We are talking quite unique, specific types of development. So
You're using
it's suggested. So I think we can be quite clear what qualifies, what doesn't qualify.
you're using the wrong name. It's private rental schemes. It's not built to rent. It's private rental schemes is what you're talking about. Change the name, for heaven's sake. You're getting too confused. Built to rent is one thing. That could be a housing association. If you're talking about somebody who builds a block of flats with a health club and cafes and stuff, and then rents that out as a block and has a management scheme, that's PRS. Full stop. You're using the wrong words.
Yeah, well, we're using the words of the government.
Well, I don't care about the government. They don't know what the hell they're doing, do they? The lunatics. You know, you've only got to look at Ukrainian refugee mess. Does the government actually know what it's doing? No, of course it doesn't. You've got to take the initiative here. It's your document. It's private rental schemes. That's what is the market. That's what the market says. That's what the planning term says. PRS. Full stop. What do you think Saxon Court is? What do you think Westminster House is?
Yeah.
What-
And if it don't
what do you think
reflect
of
government
centre?
definitions, government guidance, then we run a risk of challenge and uncertainty when we get to an examination process for a local plan. So I think it's probably prudent of us to reflect what the government's using as their definitions for different types of housing.
Okay, put the words in, but bracket PRS, private rental schemes. That's all you need to do. Use your initiative, guys. We're wasting time here. We need to get this sorted out. If you've got a document, what's the point of waiting for the outcome of the census? That's ridiculous.
Can I ask, is it a requirement that the pool scheme is offered below market?
I don't know enough about that. I don't think so below. No.
Because in that case, what you're describing is the high end private rent, in which case there is no way they have low car ownership. They would come into it.
I'd say how they're described here, you're talking at more,
CMK,
well, you're talking more affluent people being in because of the facilities that go alongside property. But the evidence gathered suggests that they
don't have a car.
they have low car ownership.
Well, we've got lucky there isn't because we don't have enough evidence. That's what the local planning inspector said.
You don't have the evidence, yeah. You're waiting for it, aren't you, from the 2021 census? If you don't have the evidence, you don't have it. If you've got to wait for it, then why are you saying you've got the evidence? You haven't.
We have evidence in relation to build to rent, which is the specific piece of work that was commissioned, because that was a gap. That was an element in our parking standards. We had this through proposals of likes of the Agora,
The reason why
where
it was a
it didn't
gap.
necessarily fit so tightly with our parking standards because it's a different type of tenure which has kind of come in, a different type of development which we've not had in the past, but we now need to respond to. So if we don't amend the parking standards SPD to recognise build to rent, then we're in the situation of dealing with each application and having a discussion probably at DCC on each application about what is an appropriate parking standard for that development. Each application, College and Highways with the applicants, transport assessment and their highways expert, and us saying we've got no standard for it, which I expect would put DCC in a slightly more complicated, challenging position in terms of how they're then being asked to grapple between quite substantive pieces of different evidence. So that's the point of having that piece of evidence, is to address that gap.
Probably is outside CMK. I don't think the logic you're using is correct. That is not what we see on the ground for private rented flats.
But I think the evidence we've got suggests
some substantial size blocks, and the block in Caldecott is we have absolute hell of parking. It's private rented housing and managed by private company. So, what's the difference?
Yeah, I think the evidence we have suggests it would be more certain zones. Zone 1, 2 would be the focus for these types of applications. So I think it is something we should consider.
Yeah.
Do we just have a standard just for those zones?
Yeah, even then, you're going to pick up the luxury flats in certain areas. They've got most of them. Most of the car ownership, it's literally all over the streets around. I don't believe that what we are seeing actually reflects. In Canberra Park, when they're trying to reduce the car ownership, literally led to fist fights on the floor.
Yeah, well, I think our work suggesting Campbell Park should be in a different accessibility zone. So if you do try and squeeze people parking, you are going to get parking on the streets there. It's a central Milton Keynes evidence suggests that.
Well, we get parking in other people's, in other sets of flat parking bays was the problem. That's where it really got to be. There wasn't enough room on the street.
I'm just conscious of the time. We've got the room till 6, so I think it's just almost there.
It was 6 and alarm went off, but take the next pills.
601.
So what?
Just something controversial just to throw on the table. We've got MKE coming along, 5,000 homes. Talk to St James about it, about whether they see any difference across MKE.
We are
It's a blank sheet of paper or blank ground at the back.
I can just, I mean, obviously with, it's been included in the zones now, as well as South East MK, recognising that it will form probably part of the urban area. I think on that's kind of pretty that's how it's classified when we dealt with the application as well. We because it currently falls outside of the zones, we assessed it as being within the urban area zone for purposes of assessing that application. It's an interesting point in terms of that development's going to be going on for however long.
Yeah, it's brownfield at the moment, or greenfield at the moment. It's going to be 15 plus years build out, and giving the developer a chance to comment rather than being impose something on it. It just was an idea, an informal conversation. But
Well, the standard, I mean, this will be a consultation document, so hopefully I would hope the development industry would engage with it as well. But I mean, it's something that we can flag up to them, because ultimately with MKEs, we would want an MRT link to it. And that's what, you know, the long-term aspiration outcome is, the planned outcome is. But hopefully with that, you'll be saying, well, actually, that's creating greater levels of accessibility. And if we're following this approach, then it's reducing the need for car ownership because you've got good alternatives.
I hope you live long enough to see that happen.
And if you're only in zone 3 at the moment, accessibility, withdraw the 21 bus, it's not zone 3.
Yeah.
So whereas in the centre you've got multiple bus routes out there in an identified area, and it's already reducing. And quite frankly, the number of people using it, it may well reduce further.
And it's always a challenge in terms of planning policy, developing your plans, because you are doing it at a point in time. I mean, I can remember from my previous experience having a discussion with colleagues around that exact point, assessing sites. And we've got forward in terms of whether we're going to allocate them in the plan or not. Public transport accessibility is a key consideration, and the frequency of the route is a key consideration. Entirely rightfully so. What if that route suddenly gets switched off in 5 years' time? And another route might come on stream. I don't know, but the fact that you're basing growth around those routes is hopefully you're actually increasing the potential patronage of those routes and then supporting them in the long term.
I've got two hands, but 4 balls in the air.
Yeah. I think we've given you quite a short time scale for you to read it. So I think if you go away and share it with others, and we can take further feedback from you once you just look at the maps and stuff in a bit more detail and how the standards perhaps would apply. In the next few weeks,
Yeah.
get further feedback, and then we won't get to the presentation until post-election now anyway. So we've got a bit of time.
Indeed, yeah, it'll be in the summer sometime. But we're working out a timetable to how we take it forward, and we'll be sharing that in due course.
It would be good to get some statement from someone as to when the census data will be available, because if they said it could be in the first quarter 2023, or it could be in 2023, there's a big difference in how you go forward as an authority for lots of things.
We can reach out to the ONS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would not be any authority asking.
No, you're right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.